Hello, my name is Kari Barclay, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the San Francisco Mime Troupe. We are glad to welcome you here today to our discussion about democracy for all in 2020, the fate of elections and voting rights in November of this year. We are here with the San Francisco Mime Troupe, who is a Tony Award-winning activist theater group based in the Bay. We have been speaking truth to power for the past 60 years. And usually you'll find us performing in public parks all around the Bay for absolutely free, trying to change the world one musical comedy at a time. I want to recognize that I'm broadcasting today from Ohlone land, unceded Native territory, and I welcome you at this time to be able to comment in the chat what native land you are zooming in or YouTubing in from. As well, I am excited to introduce to you our two guests for today. We have from the Mime Troupe, Daniel Savio, who is our composer and lyricist extraordinaire, who's worked for many years with the Mime Troupe. And as well, we have Sunny Frothingham from Democracy NC, who's been doing research work around the elections in North Carolina and much research around political causes for many years at this point. So should be a very engaging discussion. A huge thank you to San Francisco Public Library for making these talks possible. And a thank you to you for tuning on in today. This episode, the reason we're having this talk is because episode 4 of our ongoing radio series for the summer, Tales of the Resistance, this episode is called Dimension 2020, and it's focusing on the intersection of justice and the elections, but particularly thinking it takes a sci-fi lens and plays with this the genre of sci-fi to actually think about tech and social media and how those might be affecting the elections as well. So those are some of the topics that we're exploring in the episode, and we're going to use that as a jumping off point to talk about voting rights, voter suppression, and democracy in 2020 with our guest today. So I'll go ahead and give our guests a chance to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Daniel. How about you just tell us your name, how you got in, what your role is with the Mime Troupe, how you got involved with them, and one habit that you've picked up over COVID that is non-productive, that's just kind of a fun habit or hobby that's been carrying you through these times.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Savio, and this year I am the composer and lyricist for the Mime Troupe. In past years, I have been the keyboardist in the band, and I have, last year I was lyricist but not composer. And there was some year back there where I was the musical director, though neither a lyricist nor composer. So it's to some extent you just pick up whichever hat needs to be picked up at that particular moment. So yeah, I've been working with the Mime Troupe for like the past 6 years, and then there was a couple times years before that I had worked on other shows with the troupe. Habit that I have picked up in COVID-19 times. Well, here's a habit that when I answer the door to get the pizza, I put on my mask first so that I'm being kind to the person who delivers my pizza. And I've noticed that they have all had masks, every single one.
Yeah.
It's the least I can do.
So you're doing your civic duty at your doorstep. Okay, very nice. Great. And Sunny, how about you? You introduce yourself. Talk about your name. Tell us a bit more about the organization you work with, and a habit or hobby that you picked up.
Sure. So my name is Sunny Frothingham. I'm the senior researcher for Democracy North Carolina. We are a research and advocacy nonprofit based in the Triangle. So that's Durham, Chapel Hill, Raleigh, although we have organizers across the state. And we respond to all kinds of challenges that voters face. We do research on campaign finance issues. We do research on voter suppression. We are involved in litigation sometimes. And it's never a dull moment working on democracy issues in North Carolina. We, and I may talk a little bit more about this later, but we run an election protection hotline for the state of North Carolina. And last week I was getting all of those calls, and we just have to respond very nimbly to all kinds of challenges, confusion, especially in this time. So that's a little bit about my work. Although in classic sort of nonprofit style, we kind of all do everything because there's always far more work than one person is able to hold. And anyway, I work with a really great team. As far as a habit or a habit,
you're in the Shire and you talk about hobbits.
A habit or a hobby. For the first time during quarantine, I ran a Dungeons and Dragons game. I was a dungeon master for that, which, if your listeners don't know, it is a role-playing game. And it's really fun. It's been a great way to spend time with friends and family over Zoom, where we don't end up talking about the virus because we're playing this game, we're doing collective storytelling together. And I had never run one of those games before, but it has been really fun. So
fantastic. Well, in the spirit of collective storytelling, I'm going to go ahead and share with us a little excerpt from this episode, episode 4, Dimension 2020. And as a little bit of background on this, that sort of the protagonist, this is towards the end of our episode, and it's around a startup founder who's created a piece of software that anticipates your wants and needs before you actually articulate them and have them. So very much in the spirit of of advertisements, Google ads, all the things that respond to your browsing history. And somebody, one of our characters here, has come up with an idea that this might be something you could potentially use in the elections. So I will share with us an excerpt.
We have an election coming up this fall, Greg, and a lot of people are feeling pressure. Pressure to think a certain way, pressure to speak a certain way, even to vote a certain way. But that's not the American way. We want citizens to vote the way they really feel, inside, without all the deep state propaganda and the mainstream media hype.
Of course.
And wouldn't it be great if there was some app or an algorithm that would decipher what people really want from all their posts and music and tweets and emails and searches, and then just vote for them, vote the way they wish they could? Wouldn't that be freedom?
Klaya!
And with some states still on lockdown and mail-in ballots so unreliable.
She would be perfect!
Perfect.
But wait, how do you know people won't vote the way they want without Klaya? They're not slaves.
Greg, who are you planning to vote for this fall?
Well, I was thinking about Biden.
Klaya, who would Greg like to vote for this fall?
Greg sees himself as a social progressive, but a fiscal conservative. He does not realize that enacting social justice and enforcing civil rights costs money, and that's the first funding cut by conservatives. Greg does not think of himself as a racist or sexist, but is frightened of losing his skin and gender privileges in a more equitable society. Greg was raised in the working class, but has accepted the idea that being a worker is a negative, and that happiness is being able to give orders. Greg also believes the stock market will go down with a change of administration. Greg will not admit it to himself, but he would be relieved if Donald Trump were reelected.
No!
It's your algorithm.
Greg does not like the president, but from his comments, texts, reading lists, newsfeed, and anonymous posts, he believes his personal economy will be better with a crooked businessman in the White House.
Thank you, Klaya. Now, Greg, wouldn't it be better to let Klaya vote on your behalf for what you really, truly want?
What I want?
Think about it. If we could get Klaya on phones and tablets and computers across the country before the election, an app that votes for us based on who we really are without all the Me Too, Black Lives Matter guilt, without any anger about rent or schools or homelessness, and without whatever the hell Antifa wants. No more lines at the polls. Just load Klaya on your phone and ping! Meaningful, real democracy.
But what if you got hacked? The whole election would be a lie.
You let us worry about that. All you have to do is license Claire to us for this one election. It would mean a lot of money. You could finally be your own boss.
And after this election?
We probably won't need it again.
He'll think about it.
I'll think about it.
You do that. I'll let you out here. Another protest. Don't you think they're inconvenient?
No.
All right, I will stop us there. Cool, and as well, welcome Eric Rorholm, who just joined us.
Hi, I'm so sorry about the delay. I got called into work, so it's that working class lifestyle, right?
No, exactly. Very, very appropriate to what we were just listening to, actually. So, I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself in a second. But I just want to get to that clip before we forget. So something that clip dealt with was sort of two things. One is, yes, it's this sci-fi version of the elections where everything becomes automated and it happens through technology, which is, I mean, I think a fear that some people have with the mail-in ballots and the kind of concern about that. But it's also a commentary on what the role of technology is in our elections and what the role of corporate money is in those as well. So I'm curious, I know, Sunny, that you've done some work around like campaign spending and sort of corporate influence on elections. If you have like any thoughts on like how that relates to some of the work you do around election finance.
Yeah, I mean, I really love this piece. I definitely still thinking through, but I think it also raises for me, in addition to all of the, I think we often in this democracy space, we often do see tech folks come in and say like, oh, here's a solution. This is what will work. And it is not often in touch with how these systems actually work. Or it would not be secure or all of these other things. So I think that's one piece. You know, there are a lot of well-meaning efforts to get folks registered from national groups, for example, that unfortunately do things in a way that North Carolina won't accept. And so, you know, things like that where, so that's definitely something that I've seen that this made me think of a little bit, but interested to hear from other folks.
Yeah, certainly. And I know, Daniel as well, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I know you have a very like special and interesting relationship to the free speech movement and the history of free speech. And that's something that often tech companies are trying to balance on social media in terms of the ads that they do, the fake news, whether to broadcast that. And this episode is in part dealing with what sort of information are voters getting. Do you have thoughts on what it means? What would you say to folks who would attempt to sort of frame this as a free speech question?
Well, there's a long-standing tradition in the United States that money is a form of speech. That does not usually wind up working out very well for most of us. You know, it's good that organizations like Sunny's can use what funds they do have to try to get their message out there, but ultimately what it means is that those who have the money to speak, and that's not what I'm hoping for. You know, in the context of the episode, I think the characters we're listening to, Greg and BD, Greg is a little naive. You know, Greg has this really exceptional piece of technology that he's created, which could be used for good. I'm not precisely sure what method would be best to use it for good, but it could be. But the temptation being laid out here, and the, you know, his sort of malleability and the likelihood that he might fall for her arguments is scary, and I think in the reality, it's also very scary because people are following, you know, whoever it is, whichever organization we're talking about, Facebook, Google, something else. It is scary.
Yeah, I remember here in the Bay Area, I'm forgetting which primary was it exactly, but one of the primaries had some app that went disastrously wrong. And I remember there were folks in the Bay, one of my friends was in an Uber in the Bay, a shared Uber pool or something, and which is its own story these days in California. But folks inside it were saying, I could have designed a better app for that. And it's, well, the solution is not necessarily to just like, you can't fix everything with tech. But it's, yeah, I think you're right that sometimes there is this naive impression that tech can solve everything in the elections.
I mean, I think that tech is probably just by necessity going to be involved in whatever we do, but I don't think it's the source of the solution. There's a systemic solution underlying, and maybe tech would be involved in implementing that solution, but I don't see it as the source of the solution.
And tech is making things accessible in a really interesting way. Like more people can tune into this talk. We can have guests from all around the country with this. And so it's, I know in theater in particular, where we're thinking about how sometimes the Mime Troupe does everything for free, but for other theater organizations, we're getting a wider audience than ever, in part because of doing online programming. So I don't want to be like, I don't want to have this fear of tech that's unfounded, but I think it's some healthy skepticism of, is tech democratic, and how can we make sure that it's being done in a way that's not being influenced by corporate money? I think that is maybe the better question to ask.
Just to keep in mind that any piece of technology is itself, Marxist speaking, it is the means of production. So whoever has seized control of it, that's who it's going to be used for.
Great. So let's get Eric into this conversation here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Eric has been an organizer at Marquette University in Wisconsin and has been doing work both around an Iowa's satellite caucus there, and just has witnessed what's been going on, what went on in the Wisconsin primaries, and has some experience like thinking about elections in that context. So if you could just tell us a little bit, go ahead and introduce yourself. Fill in some of the things I'm missing. What sort of roles and hats do you wear in terms of thinking about the elections these days?
Sure. No, you got it. My name is Eric. I am going to be a senior at Marquette University. I'm the chair of our College Democrats chapter here. I am also on the executive board for the College Democrats of the state of Wisconsin in the Southeast region. So I have all-important Milwaukee County, as well as the swing district of Kenosha and also Racine County, which are very important swing counties as we're looking down the pike at the November election. I came here to do theater, actually, so I do have a pretty extensive theater background. I'm a scenic designer and a costume designer, and I've done my fair share of performing. And I was also a very big organizer for Bernie Sanders in the last election cycle, and that is actually how I got plugged into the Iowa caucus technological epic, shall we say.
Cool. And something I asked our other guests as well is, are there any habits or hobbies that you've picked up over the course of COVID that aren't like, no pressure, like not like productive habits, but just like things that you do these days that you didn't do beforehand?
Well, it has made me very cognizant of how much I rely on the outside world. So I enjoy now more than ever my socially distanced times at the beach on Lake Michigan. It's very beautiful. It's very nice and warm in the summertime. I don't think there's anything you can better. I don't think there's a better use of your time when everything is falling apart in the world to sit on the beach, have a cocktail, sit and relax with your roommate and just kind of unwind. It's brought me closer to nature in that way, which is funny. So
great. So I have a question for all of y'all that we can jump into, which is whether the challenges of the 2020 election are things that we haven't seen before. I think thinking about voting rights, voter suppression has been like gerrymandering has been long-term struggles. But what are there things that are different this go around that you're seeing or that you've experienced? Or to what extent is it a continuation? And I'll go ahead and get started with Sunny.
Yeah, this is a great question. And we talk a lot about it these days as we're figuring out like what will be the same and what will be different in our work of election monitoring and election protection this year. And in North Carolina, we know that we have a lot of regular structural challenges. Every general election, we will see long lines. We will see voters getting denied provisional ballots that they should have access to, or regular ballots that they should have access to. There is always something that goes wrong at a polling place, right? And that's also in line with the structural barriers to voting, like the various attempts over the last decade to instate voter ID or to cut early voting, which the majority of North Carolina voters used in the 2016 general. And so those are, I mean, I think the last decade in North Carolina is really marked by, I think it's a great case study for how white supremacy adapts, right? So it's been really defined by a supermajority held up by an unconstitutional gerrymander, passing laws on voter ID, passing laws on cuts to these voting methods that voters across the state use, but especially voters of color. And every time one of these attempts at voter suppression is struck down by the courts, which also takes a lot of time, it comes back. There are a couple like zombie laws that, as we call them, because they're just slightly different written or written in a way so that it doesn't state discriminatory intent. And I think that has been an ongoing trend here in North Carolina that's really challenging. It's kind of like a whack-a-mole situation. But in North Carolina, I would say that some of the uniqueness, and we're definitely not the only state that's definitely going to struggle to adapt and have more vote by mail. But in contrast to a California or a Colorado or a Washington state, very few voters in North Carolina historically, the very small proportion have used absentee by mail ballots. And the folks that do use them are mostly white historically. And so there are a lot of challenges there of who has even used this process before, who has not used this process before in North Carolina. In addition to small numbers of people using them, we have really high, like startlingly high rejection rates of ballots. So you go through the whole process to get your ballot and you send it back. And we just released a report on the 2020 primary, and 1 in 7 ballots that were returned were rejected. So 14% of absentee by mail ballots in this most recent primary in North Carolina. Of course, and that's really challenging. So some of that, there is some unique history that North Carolina has, which I may talk a little bit about later with absentee by mail. And then, of course, I know that where I am in Western North Carolina, some of the mail actually goes to a different state to get processed and then comes back. So even if you're going like a letter from me here at this house to the County Board of Elections here, it's not going to go straight there, right? And I think that's the case in a lot of rural areas where mail goes and then it's processed and it comes back. And I think there's a lot of concerns about North Carolina has not at this point extended kind of that deadline for ballots, although some states are doing that. And that's definitely a concern because mailing them in, it's going to be interesting to see if they're able to get there on time. So I know that's a variety of information, but I think some strong similarities. We have always had structural barriers and confusion. This year we have additional structural barriers and a ton of confusion. Every time there is a news story that is untrue about mail-in voting being tied to fraud, or every time the president tweets, we will get a wave of calls of like, what is this? What's going on? How do I know that my vote is secure? And that is really, really challenging. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, there's so much there. We'll talk in a minute about sort of specificities of your states and their histories, as well as what the role of like information and culture are in being able to shape voting. So a lot for us to chew on. But in the meantime, I want to get us to Eric to hear about your experiences with Wisconsin and Iowa. Whether, I know you're joining it for this election cycle in particular, but whether you see continuities versus unique challenges for this moment.
For sure. Well, Sunny, I appreciate you shedding light on the utility that is vote by mail, because I am from Washington State. I voted by mail my whole life. It is completely secure, completely safe, and completely easy when it is done well. So that is something to keep in mind. I also, just to throw out there, vote by mail complications are not unique to red states. In the New York primary in June 23rd, I believe, about 20% of those ballots were thrown out for one reason or another. If that had happened in a red state, there would be mass hysteria on television. I'm upset that there's not, about the amount of voter suppression that happens there, simply because every state and even a lot of municipalities have different election law. As it intersects with Wisconsin this election cycle, there are a lot of, I talk about the 2016 election in Wisconsin kind of as being two converging hurricanes, one being a historically unpopular presidential candidate bearing a historically unpopular agenda in a state that had historically voted for the party for which she was nominated. The other, though, being the legacy of Scott Walker and voter suppression finally catching up with the way that the state conducted voting. There were college student turnout dropped in every state, but in 3 of the states where it was the most stark, Wisconsin was one of them. Milwaukee County had somewhere around 55,000 fewer people vote. Donald Trump only won the state by 23,000. So the story of Donald Trump winning is in a lot of ways the reasons why people stayed home in Milwaukee County and around the state otherwise. It is extremely difficult to register to vote as a college student, particularly at my school, because 60% of the people who attend this university are from outside of the state of Wisconsin and move here. What that means, if you don't have a Wisconsin driver's license, and this applies to a lot of BIPOC people in this county, is you may not register to vote through the internet if you don't have a Wisconsin state ID. You have to apply through the mail. There's now a second layer of voting through the mail if your absentee ballot is going through the mail. So this has been a complicated process for a very, very long time. I expect it to get worse now. For example, one of the ways that Scott Walker and the Republican government here targeted the student vote was by passing a law that said IDs that expire in 4 years are not valid, specifically targeting students. You need to acquire a second ID from one of our offices here that has a picture on it as well as a signature. But that office was closed due to COVID-19. In the April presidential primary, they would not open it, they would not staff it. And so if you were not registered to vote already, you were and you did not have a passport or a military ID or a Wisconsin driver's license, which for a lot of people, a lot of young people and a lot of working class people that don't have any of those things, you are unable to register completely because you did not have a valid legal form of ID. So the story of voter suppression here is very long and it is very complicated. The US Postal Service has been a part of that story for a super long time. And of course, all of these budget cuts that we are seeing and the anticipated delays is going to affect how many students and people in this community are going to be able to register and ultimately cast a ballot.
Oh, that's heavy.
But a question, Eric, have these issues become worse with the dismantling of Voting Rights Act, or was this sort of independent of that?
Hard to say because every state administers elections completely independently, and within that, every county also administers their elections slightly differently. For example, in the April 7th election, Dane County, the county in which the state capital Madison is in, their elections commission was telling people when they applied for an absentee ballot to say that they were indefinitely confined, which is usually a status given to people that suffer from disabilities and are unable to leave the house. The county was telling people to fill that in so they could get their ballot. Other counties were saying that that was illegal. It's kind of a similar situation. This is a little bit different, but with every single county in the state, some sheriffs will not enforce the mask mandate. Some say that they will. So every county basically enforces things differently. Counties can enforce things differently between different primaries in the same year. So you really never know how much those policies are going to change between them. So as far as how much the Voting Rights Act has officially had an impact, it's kind of hard to say, although my personal insight is that it didn't have a tremendous effect because Scott Walker and the GOP's legacy on voting rights here was so detrimental anyway, that I don't really know that any federal action could have done us that much good, to be completely honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say for North Carolina, we definitely, I'm not a lawyer, but we have definitely seen clear impacts from that Shelby County decision. One of the North Carolina had a lot of previously covered jurisdictions in the state where, because of historical voter suppression, the big changes in the way elections were run required pre-clearance from the federal government for big changes that could impact voters' rights. And when that section was struck down, it meant that those protections went away for a significant areas in North Carolina. And now, of course, our coalition is litigating after the fact, but the courts take a long time. As an example of that, in North Carolina, we will go into the 2020 election and the 2021 redistricting process with ongoing litigation about the gerrymanders that were drawn in 2010, right? Like, the courts are not a sufficient remedy to this kind of voter suppression, because, and of course, those have shifted a little bit over time. We have had some wins in the courts, but the underlying issues have not been fully addressed here.
Yeah, I think on that note, like one of the challenges is think about time scales of like COVID is causing everything to kind of have to happen so quickly, and then you have these long-standing issues that take a long time to challenge. And so it's if suddenly we no longer have like mail sorting devices, like where a lot of them have been gotten rid of, like it takes so long to remedy something like that. Like when something is fixed, it takes so long to repair. And so it's this it's just unfortunate that like sometimes it feels like November is kind of this ticking clock of like what can we write in that in the meantime until then. I'd love to bring Daniel in on this question of like what has been consistent versus what has changed. And I know the Mime Troupe, every 4 years or so, we do a show that's tied in some way to the election. And I'm wondering if there's anything that y'all were thinking about differently. I mean, we're using a different format this year, but just something that you've witnessed that has felt different or similar to our past shows that we've done in relationship to elections.
Well, the different format really is having a huge impact on that specifically. In our typical years, we try to hold off on picking our subject matter and writing the show until kind of the very last possible moment, which means that we do it in a very, very short amount of time, but it also gives us the ability to have the show be as up to the moment as possible in its relevance to our social and political situation. This year, because we are writing a series of episodes instead of one play, we're able to be even more up to the moment. So the end of the series hasn't been written yet because we're waiting to see what's going to happen. We'll be writing the episodes that will air, just before Election Day, mere weeks before Election Day. So the goal is to have it be as really up to the minute relevant as possible. I don't think we've yet said anything about mailboxes going missing, but that's not impossible that'll be in one of our upcoming episodes. As far as different things and things that have been consistent, I think a lot that we're seeing this year is clearly a continuation of what has been happening for years, or an acceleration of what has been happening for years, There are some new aspects. I mean, the messing with the postal service itself that's new. I mean, we saw it coming a long way away, but it wasn't here before this administration, as far as I know. I'm sure there's more aspects. I am maybe not the most informed on some of these details.
Sure. Yeah. It's I mean, it's amazing to be able to do a show that like literally speaks to this moment, like in such real time. I think that's really exciting. And it
seems like this is like a perfect storm. Like there's all of these political things going on, and COVID-19, and environmental disasters all over the map. I mean, it's
And something cool for those who don't know is our series this summer, we're working around 4 different themes, and we're doing some around policing, we're doing some around healthcare, and we're doing episodes on unionization and labor rights in addition to this idea of the elections. So this episode being called Dimension 2020, there's so many dimensions of 2020 that we can explore. And like you're saying, it's kind of a perfect storm of everything coming together in this moment. I wanted to ask Eric, since you did have that interesting experience of the Iowa satellite caucus and kind of that whole thing, and I feel like that's an experience that can inform us about sort of what elections look like, might look like these days. If you could tell us a little bit more about what that was like for you.
For sure. So it was the Bernie Sanders campaign that got me plugged in the first place. Essentially, the Iowa Democratic Party, who administers the Iowa caucuses, of course, made the decision that they were going to allow satellite caucuses, which could happen both within the state at different times, within the state in different locations for people who lived really far away from an urban center. And also out of state. So I did end up hosting the one in Milwaukee County. I made an application. We ended up being the only one that happened in Wisconsin. It was a fascinating process. The local press here absolutely went nuts over it because the horse race journalism around elections was crazy, and especially in this primary process, at that point, it was really up in the air who was going to win. It was pretty much like a 5-way race at that point from what I remember. So I got a lot of interest in that. The actual caucus then took 15 minutes. But what's interesting about that is I had the app that malfunctioned so badly, and it was no problem for me because ours finished first. And so I put in my information, we put in our results. I did have the DNC secretary who lives here in Milwaukee, Jason Ray, help administer the caucus with me. Went very well. We had a huge viewing turnout, 50 people came in to watch. And then it was done. But as I was sitting there watching the results go on and on and on and on and on, and nothing come up, I realized that something was going wrong. And it speaks to the conversation we were having earlier about whether technology is really helpful or a hindrance as far as the electoral process goes. But what was deeply frustrating to me about that process and makes me wonder whether a caucus system is really the best way to evaluate public opinion is that all of the following sentences in some way could have been seen as true. Bernie Sanders won, Pete Buttigieg won, Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg tied. All 3 of those results could have been true depending on which metric you used, which was deeply frustrating, both because we had a press system that was very much based on this idea of horse race journalism, that we wanted a conclusive answer coming out of the caucus as to who was going to be the anointed successor. But it was frustrating because it made it very hard for voters and caucus goers to actually express the political agenda that they wanted to. And we didn't get much clarity going farther because, we had wildly different results come out of New Hampshire, then Nevada, then South Carolina. Super Tuesday said one thing, then COVID-19 got very severe. Elections continued going. They looked very different. In Wisconsin, we were deeply marred by the inability for a lot of people to vote. Pretty soon, the discussion around COVID-19 had completely changed, but at that point, everybody had dropped out, except for one, of course, Joseph Biden. So it was in a lot of ways a very frustrating beginning to a very frustrating primary process. And there's a lot of talk about whether a caucus system overall or even Iowa going first is even worthwhile at this point. But it was a chaotically fitting beginning to a chaotic year. I will tell you that.
Yes, that's certainly. since these panels are through the San Francisco Public Library, they love it when I shout out books for people to read and check out from the library. So I highly recommend, I have it on my bookshelf there, These Truths by Joel Lepore. It's an enormous history of the United States that talks about how the idea of we the people sort of got transformed into sort of an aggregate of data of sort of opinions that could be captured through polling that could capture these truths of this country. Whereas what you're saying, Eric, is totally apt, that like there can be three truths that are simultaneously valid depending on how you look at data, and it's up to us to determine what we as a political community consider the truth or consider our preferences. And so check that out from SFPL. I'm sure they have a copy. Cool. I'd love to be able to open up the floor to questions. If anybody in the audience has anything to add or to ask our guests, I'd love to get what you all are thinking. In the meantime, maybe while we wait for those questions, I know there's a little delay. Yeah, can you talk about, I mean, you've each mentioned things that are specific to your state, but if you could talk about like what you're seeing, I guess maybe twofold, of like what might be unique for your state in the 2020 elections and what could go right in terms of like what would it look like if there was democracy in your state, and do you imagine things going right? Are there any things that you think could go right that you're optimistic about for democracy in your state? And we can start with Sunny.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. You know, there's a lot that we're nervous about, but we have had some wins. You know, we at most states, I think there are less than 10 left that do not have online voter registration. That is something we had been working on for a long time in North Carolina, and that was rolled out this spring. So now, I mean, it's not without its own complications, right? It's like many states, it's run through the DMV system. So folks who have a DMV ID or a driver's license can register to vote, update their registration online. And it was a long time coming, but that's a big deal, especially in the context of COVID. Less paper forms is great. Another thing is, so Democracy North Carolina was engaged in litigation against the state board of elections, the body that administers elections. And a judge actually just, I think last week, issued a preliminary injunction, which requires the counties to institute a curing process. So if they get your ballot back, and there's something wrong with it and it's going to be rejected, they have to try to tell you, which again, may seem like a really low bar, but for North Carolina, this is an utterly unprecedented level of vote by mail. And there are definitely going to be challenges that come with that. The legislature also, one of the things that came out of some COVID legislation was that North Carolina usually requires 2 witnesses to sign your ballot. You know, for folks like Eric who have voted in Washington State, I don't know exactly what it looks like in California, but it is much more strict in North Carolina. You have to have 2 people sign your the back of your ballot envelope and say they are who you say you are. But in North Carolina, that's now reduced to 1, which is still not super accessible for folks who are living by themselves. And there's definitely a concern that getting someone to witness your ballot would lead to exposure. In North Carolina, we have a little bit of a unique history with unique history with absentee by mail voting. In the 2018 congressional elections, there was a race in Southeast North Carolina, Congressional District 11, Congressional District 9. And there was a group of people who were going out and collecting absentee by mail ballots from people, in some cases tampering with them to in favor of their candidate of choice. So that was an election. You can Google it and read about it, Congressional District 9. And I think one of the important things to note is that this was not fraud perpetrated by voters. This was fraud perpetrated by an organized group who was trying to sway the election in favor of their candidate. That is election fraud. That is a very different problem, right? But part of the reason they were able to do that was because there is just a lot of confusion, misinformation, and lack of experience with vote by mail. If you're a Washington state voter, it's not a big deal. You know exactly how it works. North Carolina voters, many of us will use absentee by mail for the first time this year. And that 2018 saga led to more strict rules that were just put into place. And now we're heading into an election where we need absentee by mail to be accessible. So that is, again, ongoing saga of voter suppression. There's a lot that's going to be hard, but I hope I've given you a couple potential hopeful things.
Yeah.
The state is also rolling out a portal where North Carolina folks will be able to request an absentee ballot online, which is new for us. So
that would be great. That's great. And I mean, I'll speak from personal experience. When I left North Carolina after college and moved out to California, I voted by mail in the 2016 elections, and I have an issue where sometimes one of my middle names is registered as a last name, sometimes it's registered as a middle name, and my ballot got thrown out for that election. And so it was like knowing that there is a system for remedying that now is huge, and knowing that I could have done it registered to vote by mail online, like would have been I don't know, it would have just made everything so much faster, and it would have totally transformed my experience of the election. So it's some good news that you're making progress around that. I'll ask Eric that same question if there's things that you're optimistic from in your state, and then we have a question from the chat that I'll get to in a second. So.
Well, sometimes it's hard to be optimistic given all the barriers that are put upon people voting.
If you aren't optimistic, I won't demand optimism, but anything that you think is unique about the situation.
I will. People forget that in 2016, the Democratic presidential nominee set foot in the state 0 times after the convention and set foot once in the state for a private fundraiser beforehand. This is a state that was deeply harmed by policies that, frankly, Clinton herself championed, especially regarding trade. There's this perception in the media that I don't think is fair, that it was wholeheartedly white working class voters that turned on President Obama and sent Donald Trump to the White House. But the largest employer around here, the largest group that was employed by manufacturing were Black men. And the Black male unemployment rate in the last 20 years has really jumped from somewhere around 20% up to right now, I think it's around 50. So the fact that there is a spotlight on these issues now is really encouraging. The fact that people are speaking about Wisconsin not as a safe blue seat that does need to be treated with any respect, but that people are actually coming here and starting to speak to the values of this state is really cool. I love that the convention was here. Unfortunately, nobody was able to be here in person, obviously, but this is a region that was hurt very badly in the last 20 years. And I don't think that it got the dignity and the respect that it deserved in the last election. It's not surprising that it abandoned the leadership of the last 2 decades. And so I am very optimistic that people are starting to look at this state in a different way. And I'm very optimistic that this state is going to return to its progressive roots and fight really hard for workers and stop fighting for racist immigration policies and, frankly, stop championing all of the racialized politics that the Trump era brought us.
Thank you. Daniel, I'm not expecting you to be like an expert on elections in California, but I'll ask if there's anything that you are sort of optimistic for around the elections in 2020.
Well, I'll try to throw you a bone on that one. But actually, what I was going to say is I, for the first time this year, signed up for voting by mail. I've always voted in person, and my polling place is literally right down the block. And I hope it will be this year as well. Although I get scared. I live in a neighborhood that has a lot of retirees, senior citizens, and I imagine quite a high percentage of at-risk individuals for if they get sick. So I'm concerned about that. So I've signed up for voting by mail. I haven't yet received a ballot. I don't know when I'm supposed to receive a ballot, actually. And I should look into that.
In North Carolina, they'll go out in early September. Like I feel like it's probably, I don't know what California is, but it's probably, they probably haven't started sending them out yet. It takes a while. They kind of have to, all the candidates, they have to get all their ducks in a row. So it's probably, they probably haven't sent them out yet, but
yeah,
worth checking.
I figured something like that would be right. I mean, who knows? If we're a little ways off right now. If the election was held today, I would be terrified because right now we have people who are simultaneously sheltering in place and evacuating their homes, like a lot of people.
Yeah.
I would say more people that I know personally are in that situation than people I know personally who have gotten sick from COVID-19. But yeah, as far as the other thing, being optimistic, a little bit. It's reserved optimism that I do think that a lot of people are aware that we are in a really, really important election. That this is a supremely important election. Will they go to the polls? Or will they vote by mail? Or will they just not do it at all? That's what scares me. That's what I'm worried about. And especially because I feel like that conservatives are pretty good about making sure they vote. So I worry. I worry about not so much about progressives. I worry about moderate Democrats. But actually, I worry about progressives too. So
Yeah.
Well, sorry if that's not optimistic.
it's fine. I mean, I'm not mandated. I think those who mandate optimism or happiness are sometimes
looking to be disappointed.
looking to be disappointed, and yeah, I don't know, making us ignore the things that are upsetting. What was I going to say? On our note of it was on our note of polling earlier. I think the second that we think that we know what's going to happen in the election, the second that we choose a destiny, right? And so I think it's always best to act like we don't know what's going to happen, because then we have to work to get our friends out there to vote, to make stuff happen. I have a question from the chat. What reason, if any, would ever justify throwing an absentee or mail-in ballot? So what are the good reasons, and then what reasons are authorities using instead to throw them out that might not be good reasons?
I'd be happy to take a crack at this one for starters. Democracy North Carolina, I said, we just released a report looking at some of the trends in North Carolina. One problem we have is that the envelope that you have to the form you have to fill out is pretty confusing. It is just a wall of tiny text. And in North Carolina, ballots can be rejected because the voter didn't sign where they're supposed to sign, because they didn't have a witness, which North Carolina requires, or because their witness signed in the wrong spot, or because according to the person who compared them, the signature didn't look enough like what the signature on their driver's license looks like. And I will say the signature on my driver's license is from when I got my driver's license in my teens. So I'm sure my signature is different. Folks who have disabilities often will have a different signature. Or if there is some research, actually, I think from California, on Asian American voters having issues seeing some issues with signature matches. And I don't know if that is related to language access questions, but there are a lot of reasons why ballots can be thrown out. A common one is because they're late, which even if you get it postmarked by election day, that can be a problem. Sometimes it doesn't arrive by the deadline. I know a lot of states are extending them, but I think that's a brief overview of some of the reasons. And it is really, really tough. When I was looking back through the data, because of the way that it's structured, you can see there are some voters for the 2020 primary who sent in several rounds of ballots, and they kept getting their ballots rejected for different reasons. And I ended up talking on the phone with some of these voters, and they were just like, I want to vote by mail, and I just keep trying to do it, and I put it in the wrong envelope, or I mix them up, or I put it, and it should not be as hard as it is. But it is a major just access issue that it involves so many structural barriers.
Oh, got it. Well, we're almost at time, so I'd love to conclude by asking each of you for just kind of a message for either for Sunny for being involved with Democracy NC, how people can support your work, how people can get involved. Eric, any message you have based on your work in Wisconsin, or things that you'd want voters to know, and Daniel, how to get involved or support the Mime Troupe's work. So let's go ahead and Eric, are you there? Or oh, okay. Well, Eric needs a minute. Let's go ahead and start with Daniel.
Yeah, so you can support us by going to our website, www.sfmt.org. And while there, you can check out the history of what we do. You can donate. You can also volunteer, and you can, especially this year, but always, spread the word and get other people listening. Now is a really great time to start listening, because these first 4 episodes of the series collectively comprise Act 1 of our story. So if you enjoy binge watching or binge listening, in this case, you can listen to all 4 the first 4 episodes right in a row, and you've got Act 1 right there, and you're ready to start in on Act 2 when that starts in another week. The other way to support the Mime Troupe is to support the more general cause of political art and political discussion, as we're doing right here.
Excellent. And I'll fill people in how to get to future episodes, how to keep track of the series in a minute. Sunny, go ahead.
Sure. Well, first, I just want to thank you, Kari, for bringing me on, and thank the San Francisco Public Library and the Mime Troupe. Speculative fiction, sci-fi, Afrofuturism have always been ways for us to critique current political conditions and imagine different futures for our communities. And I'm really excited to see democracy issues and the arts tied together in this conversation, and I really appreciate being a part of it. I will say, feel free to look us up if you're interested in nonpartisan ways to engage with elections and election protection. democracynorthcarolina.org is our website. I think if you're interested in volunteering, I know that there are a lot of ways that voters across the U.S. Can support election protection. So the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law is an organization that runs a national hotline and often has voters in states like California and New York do provide additional support on hotlines or text lines for other states that need more capacity. So that may be an opportunity, and we and DemNC are still figuring out our capacity for onboarding and training remote volunteers, but that will be ramping up. If you have generational wealth or feel like donating, that's always an option on our website. But I would say the biggest thing is make sure that your family, your communities know how to vote and know what's true about mail-in voting, which is, as Eric said, it is very secure, it is very safe, and it is a fantastic method of voting. And just do whatever you can to combat disinformation and to encourage political participation in your community.
Awesome.
Of all kinds, voting and protest.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sunny. Eric?
Well, as an official Democratic Party officer from the Milwaukee County, I want to plug to everyone the importance of getting involved in your local or county or state level, even Democratic Party. Your party can only be as responsive as the members who show up. And there are a lot of older retired people who have a lot of time who can go to those meetings. It's hard to get your foot in the door in a lot of these institutions, but our party, if it's going to be made up of working people have to show up and do the hard organizing work. So that's something that I think is really important that everybody should be cognizant of. Get your foot in the door and ascend up to leadership and make some big stakes and make sure that your party is standing up for the needs of the working people in the place that you're at. The other thing I want to plug is the only thing that can take down big corruption, big money, and big voter suppression is big organizing. That is what I am doing on this campus more than anything. There are a lot of different ways that works. The most, I want to impart a term with everybody today, relational organizing is the most important thing that we can do this November when everything is so chaotic. That is the process of organizing your close friends and your family members. Our goal as a group is to have as many people across campus as we possibly can, enough that we, because of our members, they will have friends in other sectors of campus that we do not come in contact with. And essentially every single person on this campus through personal connections will have a connection to us and know how to register to vote, know how to get their ballot. If they don't have a stamp or an envelope to mail in their documents, that they can come to us. You have to organize the people around you if you want them to be able to vote. There is no better way to bust gerrymandering, to bust voter suppression, and to bust disinformation than organization, getting together and making sure that everybody around you is voting. So that is the knowledge that I wish to impart on everybody. It's the way that we actually flipped Scott Walker's old legislative seat in the 2018 midterms, and it's going to be the way that we not only flip Wisconsin back from red to blue, but that we keep it blue, that we win big in areas that the GOP dominated, that we win back the predominantly labor blue collar areas that we lost, and that we build a foundation to make sure that this state stays true to its populist, working class, and progressive roots.
Thank you. Yes. And I love that idea of relational organizing. And I'm just thinking about those networks that we build, those connections that we build. They're great on a human level, and they're great for a variety of causes. Like I'm doing organizing on Stanford campus with allowing our graduate students who are working at the university to be in safe working conditions during COVID. And all of those networks of ourselves as like fellow students, fellow human beings, these are things that are going to come in handy with the election. These are things that are going to be coming handy with anti-racism. Just like one movement helps build multiple movements. So plant those little seeds.
It's exactly right. And we have a big movement here to unionize the adjuncts, make sure that they have healthcare and make sure that they have decent wages too. Those relational organizing networks are not just going to help you win an election in the short term. It's going to build a coalition that makes sure that your interests and your people and your community does not get stomped on by big money and by big corruption and by big politicians.
Excellent. So one final, thank you so much to Sunny. Thank you to Eric. Thank you to Daniel. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And yeah, in that spirit of continuing to raise up like working class voices, continuing to build those coalitions, the Mime Troupe, that's so much of what our mission is. We do not accept any corporate donations. We're very much a grassroots organization. So keep listening to our 9 episodes. We will have our next panel 2 weeks from now. Here on this same YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that through the San Francisco Mime Troupe, all of our pages and our newsletters. You can listen to all of our episodes through sfmt.org. An enormous thank you to the library. Thank you to our guests. And I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon.